We worked a lot on topics of regional integration, external relations, and also we used today kind of international organizations in the context of South America and relationships with the rest of the world. And it fits very, very well in our syllabus because you might remember last time we saw kind of we started period at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, because this first wave of globalization, a lot of free trade and things like that. And now the next historical period we're going to study is going to be the post-war, post-First World War period, and the opposite of that. It's going to be a period of looking inward, very critical views of international trade, and kind of the beginning of the theories and post-working theories. And if there's one organization which serves as kind of intellectual origins of that process, it's the one today is going to talk about. So I'm working with other, that's a new. But yeah, and as usually, they will first give us a presentation, and then we'll have plenty of time to have a joint discussion. So yeah,
Okay, thank you very much. I start by thanking Emanuel and Sandra, of course, for the invitation to give this lecture, and also Professor Barbara Fix, who I come later. So this talk, maybe I just briefly introduce some aspects of my research before I come to the topic. I'm originally an economist, but I moved to political science and international relations. So I work with political economy, but actually in the latest year I work more with the political than to the economy. And this research about the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, UN Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, this lecture is also summarizing a bit research that I'm doing the last perhaps a couple of years, and I'll explain that a bit later, that is bringing me a little bit more to the roots of political economy, because otherwise I've been focusing a lot about political aspect of political organization, meaning also democracy and human rights, and so I went back a little bit to the CEPAL work to understand how CEPAL thinking and production of knowledge is evolving today. But of course, for the lecture, I went back a little bit in time. So I structured it, talk a little bit, because I don't know how many of you are very familiar or not with the ECLAC. I suppose so, if you're doing something related to Latin America, but just a couple of words about what is this organization. Some particularities of ECLAC when it was created, some key concepts of development, and then, as you saw in the title, I'm actually one of my concerns with the current status of the concept of development in Latin America is about women. So I'm connecting, as I mentioned, some work that I do about democracy and human rights with development. So I am investigating, or in this research, which is a book chapter that was recently finished, I'm working with 3 levels of where are the women. One, women as authors in ECLAC's economic thought. Second, where are the women in terms of leadership as ECLAC? Focus a little bit on the former executive director, Alisa Barcelona. And where are the women as an object of development? So those of you who work with economics, you're probably more familiar with the idea of women as an object of development. But here I'm working with these 3 layers, so to speak, being exactly women as author, again, leadership in terms of this organization, and finally the object of development. So to start with, so I suppose everyone heard about the ECLAC already. Anyone who didn't? Raise the hand.
What? Again?
I suppose that everyone knows ECLAC or CEPAL, more than the acronym. Right. So this will go very quickly. As you know, ECLAC is the regional organization, but we have also similar bodies in Africa, Latin America, Africa, Asia, also Europe. But ECLAC is by far the one that's more known about the specific production of knowledge. Otherwise, you're probably more familiar with, if you think about the UN system, with other institutions like the World Bank or IMF or whatever, TARD as well. But in terms of economic commissions, I think it's very specific that this organization developed a certain tradition, a certain trajectory and legacy of production of knowledge and development, about development. And here, again, locating in fact, I don't know how well you can see the whole UN system, but I pointed here some of those institutions that are probably more familiar in terms of production of knowledge. So the World Bank, the IMF, they're specialized agencies. Then they have as subsidiary body of the General Assembly UNCTAD, the International Trade Center. WTO is a related organization, so it's quite independent. And ECLAC, there's a pointer actually here. And ECLAC is here, so it's under the Economics and Social Council, and together with the other commissions from the other world regions. And actually it's quite interesting to see, although it's not the objective of the talk today, how ECLAC influenced also these other region commissions, like how there was a diffusion of knowledge about development called South-South, from Latin America to Africa and Asia. But again, we'll talk about that in the Q&A later. And so again, here it's not obvious that CEPAL would take such a role in the production of knowledge, because these organizations, especially the ones under ECOSOC, they are more organizations to implement. So traditionally, these organizations will be diffusing some recommendations, capacity building, and that's actually in the origin of these organizations. The idea also after the end of the war, like to develop or to bring new ideas about how to reconstruct, in the case of Europe, but also to think about development in the post-war. So these organizations were supposed to implement those ideas and not really produce as much knowledge in terms of theories of development. However, then ECLAC had these particularities, and we'll be talking about that later as well, to what extent this production of knowledge is a result of these particularities, or to what extent there's some universal trends as well, and in that sense, the production of knowledge about economic theory and development can be seen as something universal, also specific to the region. And I say that because in one of the main ideas of the ECLAC's methodology or methods is that this concept of historic structuralism, which means that part of the ideas of development in CEPAL, they evolved as a counterpoint, or at least to have another type of economic theory, and with some specific criticism, of course, not all, to neoclassicism. So you do have, on one hand, the idea of structuralism, meaning that you have structures both at the domestic level, but also at the global level, that condition activities by actors, so to speak, the states, but also social actors. And on the other hand, there's the idea of historical history. So behind this production of knowledge is the idea that history is a variable, it matters. You don't have only abstract theories. Even when we talk about some universalities about this perspective, we would talk about also in historical contexts. So the question is also to what extent, for instance, other countries or regions from the south, for instance, they share some similarities, historical similarities, that we could see a certain diffusion of that production of knowledge, or theories or approaches, recommendations that also make sense for the development of the regions. So it's not, it's a question of historical contextualization also in the global economy, in the global process as we'll see also, of inequalities at the global level. So here I think this particularity again is to bring this element of history and also structuralism in the production of knowledge, and also from the beginning an idea about equity, and then we see value of equity, equality. I mean the word means different also for different authors. but mainly the idea that to handle the question of inequalities at the global level and internally also in the societies, in the countries and in the region of Latin America and Caribbean. And social justice, so of course technical progress and social justice. So this is from the beginning very clearly something that is opposing some of the ideas of classic economic theory. That's why in one of the texts that I put for you to read, I don't know if you read, but one of the texts, also the author situate those theories, or of course we talk about CEPAL, but very different boulders as well, or different phases as we see, but broadly speaking, normally, I mean, there's a connection of those perspectives with heterodox theories, although again, we see also some differences depending on the authors, both heterodox economics, but also of CEPAL. And this here, I mean, there is not only at the homepage of CEPAL, but there are a lot of books organized, and I think maybe it's one of the institutions from the UN that has more books about itself, about the production of knowledge, about the knowledge. So the homepage is excellent to do research. You find a lot of materials, original materials, documents, and also there are a series of books that try to interpret this production of knowledge. And one of them, I think that would be a lot of people know well, and he's an economist at UFRJ in Rio de Janeiro. And he has been one of these co-editors of many of those books. And those authors, they have this care of the legacy, right, to explain the differences or the phases as well. And to a certain extent, I mean, of course, they have those separations of the timeline in terms of decades, but that overlaps a little bit with also temporalities. But I think in the center, of course, is the presence of Raul Prebisch as the first Secretary General. So it has been an economist who has contributed a lot of his own political thought to the organization. And he was Secretary General from 50 to 63, so 13 years, it's a lot. And you can see that he brought then these theories to the organization. And I think it's probably fair enough to say that that's why it became such an imprint of those particularities. Because normally you have Secretary Generals that come and go, and even if they bring their own ideas and thoughts, I mean, they get dispersed over the years, but that was the beginning of CEPAL, and he stayed a lot, and he brought especially the concept also of central periphery. So in the structure at the global level, they had countries in the center of the capitalist system and countries in the periphery of the capitalist system, and that created some structural legacies that we can even argue that are certainly present until today in terms of how those countries they engage with the international trade, investments, capital, and mainly it has the theory of, I don't know how familiar or not with that, but anyway, so the idea that he with a lot of let's say contestations also in the later years, but he argued that you have this tendency of the exchanges of the periphery and the center to not the gap of development wouldn't be closed, because you have basically the elasticity of the exports of commodities and industrialized products. So in the end, the development gap between countries in the center and periphery, they would again not close. You have to think about other means to close that gap of development. So in the beginning of CEPAL, and but also into the 60s, you have the idea that, first of all, those countries, they would have to then protect their own industries and substitute the imports of industrialized countries to be able to create their own industrialization and their own technology. And what is not as much present in those discussions here is that also at the regional level, the idea is that you should integrate regionally, because through that integration with South-South, of course in a way, which was not called South-South, but within Latin America, those countries could enlarge their markets, and they could, in principle, the idea is that they could develop their industries and export and import among themselves. So in the idea, in the beginning, you had, of course, depending on the government of the states at the time, you had some countries that interpreted this substitution of imports more at the domestic level, and some that forged that more at the regional level, and that has been the case up to now. That some ideas of be it industrialization or also autonomy, that's a concept that goes hand with these ideas, they are implemented more domestically or more regionally, or in sub-regions of Latin America and the Caribbean. We can talk about that a bit later. But anyway, those recommendations in the beginning of CEPAL, they matter a lot. So if today someone who doesn't know anything about CEPAL, you would, or know very few, you would immediately think about that first economic thought that was pretty much imprinted in the beginning. So around the 60s and the 70s, and we have to now contextualize that historically. Now we had, of course, in the 50s, the end of the Second War, the beginning of the reconstruction also in Europe, but then you had immediately also the Cold War developing in the case of Latin America with the military coups, and also some countries more aligned with the US, but some countries with a lot of domestic struggles still. So when we talk about those development models, it's always important to have that in context. I mean, we didn't have democracies, especially here in the 60s, from the 60s to the 80s, in most of those countries, except for Venezuela, who was not a military dictator at the time, you had cycles also. Now, some governments would be more, incorporate more CEPAL's idea, and some governments that would not. So that's why when you talk about the development of regional integration in the region, there are some countries that will put that more as the front line of their engagement, even with the developmentalists, and some others that will be again more implemented more domestically. So in the 60s, you had a lot of this debate about structural reform. So again, the idea of structuralism in CEPAL is both at the global level, central periphery, but also internally. So you had the domestic systems, the industry, the production, labor, all these categories of economic development, they're seen as structural, in opposition to a more neoclassic view, where the actors and the companies or the business, they are free, so to speak, to put forward innovation and so on. The idea is that you need these structural reforms for countries to diminish their internal inequalities. Therefore, in the 60s and 70s, again, you had a variation, and parallel you had a movement of integration of the whole Latin America. So you have the ALARD and ALARD. I mean, these are processes of regional integration that foster trade and liberalization of trade between those countries, but also the formation of sub-regions. So especially in the Andean countries, for instance, you had the Andean Pact already in the end of the 50s, which tried to combine those countries, but also those economies in a more, at that time it was not seen as a regional integration as we see today, but the idea of collective engagement, let's see, at the global level. However, if we think again about the political context, we know also that towards in the 70s you have the end of the courage of the dollar, and in the 80s that led, among others, to a whole crisis of capital, of the so-called debt crisis in Latin America. Therefore, in the 80s, you had, again, that parallelly, you had already a lot of political disputes among those countries. In the case of Brazil, for instance, you did have, even within the dictatorship, dispute between countries that would be in favor of this court substitution, but also some sectors that were already in the line of also the more global level discussions looking for the liberalization. That's why you had, in the case of the Andean Pact, for instance, already this idea of liberalized trade also globally. But as CEPAL's production then in the 80s focused a lot on the debt crisis, because in a way the argument was, well, those countries were implementing those recommendations, substitute imports, industrialize, and in fact that took place in some of the countries. Of course, it varies a lot in so many countries, 30, 50 countries, but there was a process of industrialization, and in a way that those policies were not being seen as effective, because most countries, they were actually still with the domestic inequalities and not closing the gap, so to speak, and especially with the debt crisis, then CEPAL changed its line of thought and started focusing on the pressure of the debt, so more about the financial aspects and the capital markets aspects, and that's where there was a certain loosening already of these traditional ideas of the models of import substitutions. But also in the 80s, as we know, I mean, you start having towards the end of the Cold War, and then from the mid-80s to the end of the 80s, where you really have then, especially in Europe, the end of the Cold War, but already the transition to democratizations from 86, 87, in most of those countries. We had also the new ideas also about development in that sense, that it would culminate then with in the 90s with then the democratization of most of those countries. And I don't know, you mentioned that you were focusing until the Second War, huh? in the last class. So actually here in the 90s, I mean, you did have then completely unilateral also embracement of neoclassicism, and also liberalization of trade, capital by most of those countries. And in the case of CEPAL, then the middle of that middle phase is called productive transformation to equity. Meaning that, and if you read also that article by Marcena that I put for you, I mean, there was a concern that CEPAL wouldn't lose its tradition of having a structural element in its production of knowledge. However, in the 90s, as we know, I mean, there was, the end of the Cold War. In the case of Latin America, the so-called Washington Consensus was very relevant. So most of those countries that were transitioning to democracy, they also transitioned in terms of their models of development and embraced the Washington Consensus. And so, in a way, during those first years, that legacy of thought in CEPAL seemed completely outdated in a way. It was criticized, but if you look at those texts produced by CEPAL, there was this concern of not abandoning completely those previous thoughts, and that's why in the 90s and from the 90s on, we called also the neo-structuralism. We can discuss later, maybe it's a bit of a euphemism, because, of course, the heart of the historical structuralist methodology to think about development was abandoned. In the case of the regional process of integration, they abandoned completely, for instance, substitution of imports, and engaged in neoliberalization. However, still with that concept of autonomy. So, not produced by CEPAL, but very close contact, so to speak, in terms of some lines of thought. We had also the idea of open regionalism at that time. So neo-structuralism in the 90s for CEPAL meant that, okay, there are still structural elements of engagement with the global level, trade and capitals, and also there are structural, internal to the Latin American countries and the regional integration, structural barriers to development. However, this neo-structuralism basically meant that you were incorporating a lot of premises of the Washington Consensus by liberalization of trade, privatization, liberalization of capitals, but with some restrictions. So the idea of the concept of autonomy was still present in the regional integration processes. If you think about under community or Mercosur, for instance, they were engaged in trade liberalization, but still having some areas protected in the case of Mercosur, for instance, the automobile sector or sugar sector. And so there were some elements of this structural approach behind it, that you needed to have this insertion in not only based on commodities, because you still had that gap not closing from before. And we'll go back to some of these elements later, but just to have an overall view for the moment. You had during the 90s and the 2000s, then this transformation, and that's where I think here the concept of equity appeared. That you started having a concept of development that was less based on this macroeconomic or trade and capitals, and having more and more a discussion about also social inequalities and other elements that will increase all over those years. Because in the 2000s then you have the concept of citizenship, like central, meaning here that you have again one of the structural barriers was considered exactly the social inequalities. Because if from the economic perspective, now if you have more industry, more consume, and so on, you have the expansion also of the markets, but what those arguments and those papers and produced by Cepal were arguing that if you don't have a distribution of wealth in the countries, which is deeply associated also with social inequalities, you want, and also democratic, like fragility of institutions, for instance. If you don't handle with the fragility of institutions and democratic action, inclusion of the populations, the idea that expand the markets will also won't happen, and will still represent a barrier for this previous idea of development. So you have again equity, citizenship as being included in the concept of development. And then in the 2010s, even more frontally, equality being a difference to equity, and from then on up to now, I mean, I think it increased ever more the idea that you need to handle with those social and political elements of inequalities to be able to have also, let's say, a wealth or a more traditional economic resources distribution. And here, if we look at the process of regional integration, is where we have also politically at that time, in the beginning of the 2000s, you have the so-called pink tide, and you have most countries of the region movement, the cyclical movement of election of governments from the central to the central left, to the left. That's where, for instance, Chavez was elected in Venezuela. You have Lula in Brazil 2003. You have the return of the Peronists, because basically during the 90s, when those countries they adopted all these neoliberal and Washington consensus policies, towards the beginning of the 2000s, I mean, there was a realization that those policies didn't bring actually that inclusion and development. So you had a political turn, and then Cepal had a new, again, you have to see this, the new waves of production of knowledge of Cepal associated to this transformations of the political context, and a more central to central left wave in the region that then was much more willing to include other elements of development. And so here, the idea of sustainable development was also included in the sense of environment and climate change, and equality in all layers, and we'll talk about very soon on the question of gender as well. And I would say that we are still in this moment from the 2000s and in the last volume that was produced, edited also by Ricardo Bielowski and Alisa Baxena, including until 2018. We have this moment of a production of knowledge where the development, the economic development is ever more linked to even human rights and those internal inequalities. The idea of inclusion and sustainability. And here we have just symbolically a picture of the building of Cepal, because it shows also a bit of these expectations. So when this building was constructed, it was, I forgot the name of the architect, but anyway, the idea is that you are really having an ambitious institution where you create knowledge and you have a new phase, a new in the moment. I said already some of this, I talked a little bit about these concepts, but now just to move from this more chronological sequence of main ideas to a more conceptual one, Cepal keeps still based on these two main ideas, structuralism and new structuralism. structuralism being to a large extent corresponding to the first period of production and highly influenced by Krevich. So global economy is a bipolar system comprising of center and periphery, specialized in the production and export of commodities, media technological content, heritage of colonial model of production, theory of the derived trend of the terms of trade, and the idea that to overcome underdevelopment or this periphery status, you need industrialization, planning, trade revitalization to promotion of regional integration. As I mentioned on this previous slide in a lab, so it was a regional integration covering all Latin American countries. Not as much the Caribbean, because Caribbean in that phase, until the 90s, Caribbean was quite separate. Actually, some of the countries are not even independent yet. And then new approaches to foreign investment, tax, and agrarian reform, and so on, and technical cooperation. So that was, to a large extent, the first package, let's say, that was evolving was from Krevich original ideas. And neo-structuralism, again, then, especially after the 90s. But again, of course, depending on the country, you had, it's not a clear cut. No? Some countries still went back to structural or structuralism later. But to a large extent, this idea that somehow had to give an answer to the Washington Consensus was there. So the idea of neo-structuralism, I think it's one of those concepts that are quite, for lawyers somehow to invent those concepts. Because it is structuralism, but it's neo. So what exactly is neo, new or not? And I mean, it's questionable. I think here in the beginning, as we saw, there was still a lot from the old ideas. So the idea of autonomy was still present, definitely Mercosur, definitely the community. If you remember also, in the Washington Consensus, one of the ideas led by Bush at the time was to have this regional integration in the whole Americas, the ALPA, or the FTA. And through the regional organizations in Latin America, there was an attempt to make that slower. So again, it is a heritage of structuralism. The idea is that, okay, countries are embracing neoliberalism, are privatizing, they are, to a certain extent, buying the Washington Consensus, but not so fast. Because there was an idea, well, there's a lot of inequalities, there's no technology, I mean, all these sectors are basically, all the attempts to industrialize, and sometimes with some success, such as the case of Brazil, for instance, there's a lot of industrialization. If everything now is liberalized, all these industries will break. So again, on one hand, pushing for Washington Consensus, on the other hand, even in the 90s, because of course, these are governments, now recently democratized, have a lot of social actors, economic actors that translate into lobbies in the Congress, that translate into infights between ministries. So even if you have presidents who would embrace that, such as the case of Brazil with Paulo de Mello, you still don't have that immediately translated into the whole society, not to the firms and the persons and so on. Because you have a lot of this idea of impregnated, so to speak, of structuralism. And so Mercosur and their community, they basically transposed more to the regional level the autonomy concept and the concept of creating a market to buffer the global market. So, of course, you can ask to what extent the regional hegemons at the time, be it Colombia, be it Brazil, could also profit from that. We can go in the Q&A later. It's not only about economic theory, and it's also about the political will of those governments. And obviously, I mean, if in the region you have some countries that manage to expand their markets, sometimes it's at the expense of others. And that has been the case of Brazil very often as well, for instance, or Colombia also. So countries that were already bigger markets, and that they managed to expand their own industries or their own even agriculture at the cost of some smaller countries in the region. But still, it was about structuralism, about creating a buffer zone, and in the end, successfully not approving the FTA. So most of the countries in Latin America, they didn't join the FTA, and integration of the global markets foreseen by the US at the time stopped in Mexico. So Mexico, there's the creation of NAFTA. Mexico was, let's say, engaged in this asymmetric regionalism. while the other countries in Central and South America created their own, the Central American common market, and at that time already the CARICOM, also in the Caribbean, and basically the community in the South, Mercosur. So again, neo-structuralism. Something is new, but something was also still based on structuralism. Still, some legacies of the so-called lost decade and the debt crisis are present there. So in terms of macroeconomic policies and so on, a lot was done. And the focus also on the necessity to have macroeconomic stability. That's something new, definitely, vis-a-vis the discussions before. The question of inflation, for instance, because it was a new phenomenon also from those times, from the 90s on. So you had also, in terms of economic policies, a focus on macroeconomic stability, a focus on fighting inflation, with some, of course, then neoclassical implications for other areas. Here, then, the concept of open regionalism was consolidated, as I mentioned, vis-a-vis the process of integration of the structural moment, when you had the closed regionalism. Now you have this open regionalism. So now structuralism is not the same thing as open regionalism, but they coincide more or less in time. Because regional processes of integration, they are labeled like this wave of open regionalism. So they draw a little bit, of course, on neo-structuralism, but they also have much more of what will come only more in the 2000s in Cepal's thought, that is this concern also with the internal inequalities, because then here, of course, you had very concrete social actors engaged in regionalism. You had a lot of societal actors that in this open regionalism, they were thinking that it was also the process of democratization. Those social actors, they were bringing their demands also to Mercosur or the other community. Therefore, you had a more blurred, in the end, concept of development. And as we see, I'll talk later about women and gender, I mean, here is very clear, for instance, the importance of those social movements that were engaging with the Mercosur, for instance, or the other community. And here, so not to forget, the question of environment is already very, very clear. We have already here as well, at a focus later, that Alisa Barcena was elected in 2008. And she has a background from biology. So when she became Secretary General in Cepal, she also brought a lot of the sustainable development idea. But I come back to that later. And so within neo-structuralism, this idea of the structural barriers to development, they start more and more being connected with the idea of the Agenda 2030 and development goals. And if you know about Cepal work, mostly, I mean, these are recommendations to nation states, to the states. So they produce this knowledge, they produce those recommendations, but they also, in terms of the implementation, what we see after, especially the last decade, is that more and more the dialogue with the Agenda 2030 and development goals, the Millennium to the Sustainable Development Goals, just increased. So I come back to this later because I think it's very important. I just put here some other concepts that sometimes you hear. Cepalism, of course, is a broader name that will enroll all this knowledge production. Developmentalism, that is not really, obviously, something from Cepal, but the idea also that you have in economic theory the concept of development along with growth and the role of the state. Independence theory, that would require itself a whole lecture, but I mean, I think independence theory draws a lot on Cepal's economic thought. Independence theory brings some of those elements of structural inequalities to more political science and sociology. So in the end, you have a new branch of theoretical development that evolves from there. So again, there is a certain parallel, but it's also different things. But mainly, I think the connection with the internal and external inequalities is very important, because the structuralism, again, is global, center periphery, but internal inequalities. And dependence theory exactly put the point on that, of how after democratization we have barriers, structural barriers to not only democratization but also development because of social inequalities. You have mobility, you don't have those social policies that are implemented by the new democratized countries. They don't translate immediately into inclusion, development because of the social barriers that we'll talk about in a moment. So these are the key concepts. And I move now to the question of women. As I told you, I mean, that's actually new research that engaged a couple of years ago. I was engaged in a group. Actually, it started with the COVID because I was working a lot of things online, if you remember. And somehow I entered in this group of concerns with the COVID. And maybe you remember, I don't know if you saw in the news at that time, that you had a discussion about women in leadership fighting COVID. I don't remember if you saw that. But there were, I won't remember now the specific persons, but I think there was in Norway, there were a couple of countries, I think in Iceland, there were a couple of countries that for some reason suddenly had a debate. Are women, are prime ministers, whatever, presidents of countries involved doing something different? And I ended up in that group for some reason from the ISA, the International Studies Association. And then we started doing some research, originally then about COVID. And that evolved, I evolved with the dialogue with that group. And in a certain moment, we started, it's a book, basically a book, a written book. And each of us, we focused on one women in leadership during COVID. And I chose at that time Alisa Barcena. And from that work about her leadership in CEPAL, then all this research that I'm engaged now evolved. And so it was quite interesting because, so at that time when I started doing that research was, so what did Alisa Barcena do at CEPAL? Is she doing something different? Because that was, each of us chose one woman in leadership, and that was a question. So I had no idea. I was not working at CEPAL anymore at that time. And I started looking at what she was doing. And of course, because we have women in leadership doesn't mean anything per se in particular, so there was a empirical research. But I started then, that part of the research I started doing, and I found very few secondary sources, but one of them I put for you also. No, I didn't put this as the main reading, but the secondary one, because the invisible ones, by Rebecca Bittencourt and Camila Spinell, because they actually, I found that's the only secondary source that I found at least, is that because they had that question too. This book here, about the handbook of history of women, economic thought, they have this chapter about women at CEPAL, and they argue, and it's a very empirical thing, but they show basically that when you look at this production of knowledge at CEPAL, all the authors, we talk about Trevish, but of course there are Stuka and so on, there are a lot of authors, but there are hardly any women. I mean, and they mentioned that, okay, there's Maria Conceição Tavares, who is actually a Portuguese, but then moved to Brazil, and she was a professor at the UFRJ, and she grounded the very established Department of Economic, Paradox Economic, until today in UFRJ, with lots of variations from Marxism, but anyway, some department there. So she's really the person. She passed away now in 2024, but she was by far the only name that people would associate CEPAL's thought with the woman. My data person age was a very particular one, perhaps. Then in this chapter they also look at online visibility, and then they mentioned Alisa Barcena because she was Secretary General, so of course she's a lot online. And Stephanie Griffith-Jones, who is an economist. Actually, I had the pleasure not to work at, I think Pamela knows that, to work with her in a project some years ago, because she also, works with her anyway. So they are quite visible online. Stephanie, because she's also, she's not based at CEPAL, but she worked with Kampuna, who is a big name from CEPAL as well, who was also Secretary General and published a lot on that. So these are the two names basically that if you think about about CEPAL development production, you think at the most about those three women. And then what they also do in this chapter is they look at the publications available in CEPAL's digital repository, and they do that because in the chapter they also make that point that the production of knowledge about CEPAL, of course, you can, as a professor at the university, whatever, you can think about CEPAL and you can do something, but when you talk about production of knowledge at CEPAL, what is meant here is actually people working with CEPAL and through CEPAL and engaging, and so they make this point that it's important to look at there's a lot of production, so there's not only policy recommendations, but there are a lot of analysis, and it's all online, so I think that's the good thing also to work with that. You have all online, all these publications, and what they do is a quantitative thing, they explain in the chapter how they do that. But they end up with these documents that are basically analysis, economic analysis or recommendations. This 31,000 documents, and they show that only 28% are authored by women. And there's this table here on the left. And in the table you see here from that rank that they do, the number of publications and the rank that they do. So there is some, of course, here first and second, for instance, are less known people. That means that more like technical staff were doing a lot of things, but they didn't become visible as a key author or again, with this visibility online and so on. But it's about 703rd. And then the Stephanie Griffith-Jones here. And then Maria da Conceição Tavares here. So she, of course, she has a lot of production published in CEPAL documents, but maybe we can argue that she became even more known because of her known CEPAL documents, and she became a kind of a academic, such as Stephanie Griffith. And then interesting, so you have those three that we said, and then we have here Maria Nieves people, Sonia Montano, and those two, and I put here, because when we look at women at CEPAL, not only the Secretary Director, Alissa Barcenia, but I put here some institutional changes that took place at CEPAL. So you had, worse than 2000, there is upgrade of the unit of women and development to a division of gender. So CEPAL is the only regional economic commission that they went to have a gender unit with a director leadership level. Because when you talk about leadership, I focus on Alissa Barcenia as the top. But the point is that we have to look at other types of leaderships too. And here, the directors of that gender unit, division of gender at CEPAL are Sonia Montano from 2000 to 2015, so that's here, her. Maria Neves Rico, 2015-2020, so she's here. And the current one, Ana Guismes Garcia, she's not yet here, but I expect her to be there at some point because she's writing a lot. And the second paper that I put for you to read is written by her. So she's the current director, and I interviewed her recently for that book chapter, which was quite interesting, but I've saved something for later. But anyway, so she's now this director, and this unit, that's the interesting thing, that through that unit, and also the Observatory of Gender Equality, the main role, their mandate actually, is to organize the regional conferences on women, because you have the Beijing, the global level conference, with the Beijing and so on. Then you have at Latin America and the Caribbean, you have regional platforms, negotiations, conferences also. So at CEPAL, their main role here formally is to, like, when the chefs of state and government, they have those conferences, they take decisions, they have those decisions. So their main role is to implement those decisions at CEPAL and diffuse those recommendations to member states. So again, it's all soft law, they decide that, and what they do is what? They publish all these recommendations. They can do consultancy to specific countries. Now, if the country has an issue, they can go to CEPAL and request something. And they also keep this Observatory of Gender Equality, with a lot of statistics. Because I was surprised actually when I saw that. Because on one hand, when you start start bringing gender to the discussion, it is also a criticism of neoclassic economics. However, it's in a lot of those papers when you're reading, they say it must be an empirical thing. It's not an ideological thing like pure political in terms of the question of inclusion. Of course, that's important. But here, their main claim is that to have statistics about the level of inclusion of women in labor and in all sectors, as we see in a moment. So this observatory of gender equality and this statistics, a lot has been done about how you have to modernize statistics. You have to bring numbers that were not there before. You have to bring evidence, for instance, of care work, of issues that in those perspectives and what they write about is that it's not as much that you have bad economics or the classic or the it's not that it's bad, it's blind. So you have to bring more elements for economic theory, even more orthodox, to see where the inequalities, where the structural barriers are. And if you don't have statistics, you don't have that evidence, you cannot do that. So that's quite interesting because they have this very technical approach to it. It's not ideological. Especially in Latin America, I think it's important not to mix those two. And then I also put here, like today's the cause of organizing twin divisions. Why? Because if you see here social development, that has been an issue when I was doing that research. Because if you look at Ocampo or some of more traditional like authors, even Stephanie also, for instance, it's not, those people are not focused on gender per se, the way that you'll see that is being done now, but the social element was also present. And that's important because gender was there from the beginning, especially, we see there was already that regional conference of women from the 70s. So it's not that it's completely new, but as we'll see, it's a new agenda for the production of knowledge. So the second question then was where the women the leadership. So we saw already a bit that there's Gefei-FIONA, but there's also those other in the gender department, also women, but again, it doesn't have to be a woman, but anyway, in the gender department there was also those women. And just to show again, I mean, Gefei-FIONA, she was secretary from 2008 to 2022. So she got the COVID. That's why I started working now about her. She was in the COVID times. No? And again, it was crucial to understand this focus on gender since then that we empirically see that there is.